Sometimes the most valuable things in life can't be bought with money. Sometimes a single moment of kindness can change two people forever. In 1873, a mountain man named Holt Kincaid sent $9 for a mail-order bride. That was 3 months of hard work. When Clara arrived in Briar's Crossing, people laughed at her. They called her a bargain bride. She stood there shaking, believing she was unwanted and worthless. Then Holt did something nobody expected. He dropped to one knee right there in front of everyone and looked her in the eyes. What he said next silenced the entire town. What could make a rough mountain man kneel before a frightened young woman he'd never met? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The Montana Territory in the winter of 1873 was not a place for the weak or the uncertain. It demanded everything from those who chose to make it home: strength, resilience, and a particular kind of stubborn hope that could survive the long, dark months when the snow piled higher than a man's head and the wind cut through wool and leather like it was nothing at all. Briar's Crossing wasn't much to look at, even by frontier standards. A collection of weathered buildings huddled together in a valley where two streams met. It served as a trading post and supply station for trappers, prospectors, and the handful of families stubborn enough to try farming in soil that seemed to grow rocks better than crops. The main street, really the only street, ran a quarter-mile from the livery stable on the south end to the church on the north, with the general store, saloon, hotel, and sheriff's office scattered in between. Most folks in Briar's Crossing knew each other's business, for better or worse. In a town of maybe 80 souls, privacy was a luxury nobody could afford. When someone sneezed at breakfast, half the town knew about it by supper. And when a man like Holt Kincaid came down from the high country with a purpose in his step and $9 silver clutched in his work-roughened hand, well, that was the kind of thing people talked about for weeks. Holt Kincaid was what the townspeople called a mountain man, though he'd never much cared for the label. He lived alone in a cabin he'd built himself about 8 miles up into the peaks, in a spot where the pine trees grew thick and the streams ran cold and clear year-round. He made his living trapping beaver and marten, hunting elk and deer, and trading pelts twice a year when he came down to Briar's Crossing with his pack horses loaded. He was 34 years old, though the weather and the hard living had carved lines around his eyes that made him look older. Tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that brushed his collar and a beard he kept trimmed short, he moved with the careful economy of a man who'd learned to conserve his energy for when it mattered. His eyes were grey, the color of storm clouds, and they carried a sadness that never quite left, even when he smiled. The cabin where Holt lived was solid and well-made, built from lodgepole pine he'd cut and notched himself. It had a stone fireplace that drew well, a roof that didn't leak, and windows fitted with real glass he'd hauled up the mountain on his back. Inside, everything was neat, and ordered, his few possessions arranged with care, his tools maintained and sharp, his firewood stacked precisely against the wall. It was the home of a man who'd learned to rely on himself for everything, who'd made peace with solitude because he'd had no other choice. But it was also lonely, achingly, desperately lonely, in a way that Holt had tried not to think about for the better part of 5 years. He hadn't always been alone. Once, a lifetime ago it seemed, he'd had a family. A father who'd taught him to track and hunt, a mother who'd read to him from the Bible every night, a younger sister named Lily who'd followed him everywhere like a shadow. They'd had a small ranch in Wyoming Territory, nothing grand, but it was theirs, and they'd been happy. Then came the raid. Holt had been 19, out checking the fence line in the far pasture when he'd heard the gunshots. By the time he'd ridden back, it was over. His family was gone, the house burning, everything he'd loved torn away in the space of minutes. He'd buried them in the yard where his mother's garden had grown, and then he'd walked away from that place and never looked back. For years after, he'd drifted, unable to stay in one place, unable to form attachments, unable to do anything but move and work and try not to remember. He'd punched cattle in Colorado, worked as a guard on wagon trains, hired his gun out to anyone who'd pay. He'd been angry and reckless and more than half in love with the idea of dying, though he'd never quite managed it. Eventually, the anger had burned itself out, leaving only emptiness. He drifted north into Montana territory, found the spot where his cabin now stood, and decided he was tired of running. If he was going to be alone, he might as well be alone in a place of his own choosing, doing work that didn't require him to be around other people and their noise and their questions and their inevitable disappointment. For 5 years, that had been enough. The routine of the seasons, the satisfaction of work done well, the quiet companionship of the mountains. He'd convinced himself he didn't need anything else, that he was content with what he had. Then came last winter. The worst winter in memory, with storms that lasted for days and temperatures that dropped so low the sap froze inside the trees and split them open with sounds like gunshots. Holt had been snowed in for nearly 3 weeks straight, unable to check his trap lines, unable to do much of anything except feed the fire and wait for the weather to break. In that long stretch of enforced isolation, with nothing but his own thoughts for company, something inside him had shifted. He'd sat by the fire one night, mending a tear in his coat, and realized that he couldn't remember the last time he'd spoken more than a few words to another person. Couldn't remember the last time he'd heard laughter in his home, or shared a meal with someone, or simply sat in comfortable silence with another human being. He was surviving, but he wasn't living, and he was tired of it. When spring finally came and the snow melted enough for him to make the journey down to Briar's Crossing, he'd done something he never thought he'd do. He'd gone to the general store and asked Herman Schultz, the proprietor, about matrimonial agencies back east, places where a man could write to a woman who might be willing to come west and marry him. Herman had been surprised. Everyone knew Holt Kincaid kept to himself, but he'd pulled out some old newspapers and catalogues, and together they'd looked through the advertisements. Women seeking honest, hard-working husbands, men seeking respectable, industrious wives. The whole business had felt strange and transactional, like buying livestock, but Holt had pushed through his discomfort because the alternative was going back up that mountain alone, and he couldn't face another winter like the last one. He'd finally settled on an agency in Philadelphia that seemed reputable. The advertisement said they matched men and women of good character, that they conducted interviews and verified information. There was a fee, $9 to register, and arrange for a bride to be sent west, $9. It had taken Holt nearly 3 months of trapping to save that much after buying the supplies he needed to get through until fall. $9 was a significant sum, more than many men made in a month of hard labor. But he'd counted out the coins carefully onto Herman's counter and asked him to help write the letter, since Holt's schooling had ended when his family died and his handwriting was rough. In the letter, he'd been honest. He'd described his cabin, his life, his work. He'd said he wasn't looking for romance or grand passion, just a companion who could help him through the seasons, someone to share the load of frontier living. He'd said he was a widower easier than explaining the truth, and that he was a decent man who didn't drink to excess or raise his hand in anger. He'd promised to provide for her and treat her with respect. Then he'd sent the letter east and tried not to think too hard about what he'd done. The months of waiting had been strange. Part of him expected nothing to come of it, that some woman back east would read his simple letter and decide a mountain man in Montana territory wasn't worth her time. Another part of him had found himself making small preparations, just in case. He'd built a separate sleeping area in the cabin, partitioning, off a corner with pine boards to give her privacy. He'd carved a wooden box with a lid, something she could keep her belongings in. He'd even washed the windows and swept the floor more regularly than usual. Sheriff Tom Brennan had noticed Holt coming to town more often than normal, always asking if any mail had come for him. Tom was one of the few people in Briar's Crossing who Holt considered a friend, a quiet man in his 50s with a salt and pepper beard and kind eyes who didn't pry into other people's business unless he had to. One evening in late summer, Tom had found Holt at the livery stable checking on his horses and had joined him at the fence rail. "Heard you sent for a mail-order bride," Tom had said without preamble. Holt had tensed, expecting judgment or mockery, but Tom's voice had been neutral. "Word travels," Holt had replied carefully. "It does." Tom had been quiet for a moment, watching the horses. "For what it's worth, I think it's a good thing. Man shouldn't live alone if he doesn't have to. Gets to where you forget how to be around people." "Maybe I already forgot," Holt had said. "Nah, you're just out of practice." Tom had clapped him on the shoulder. "She'll be lucky to have you, whoever she is. You're a good man, Holt. Don't let anyone tell you different." Those words had meant more than Holt could say. In a town where he'd always been the outsider, where people whispered about the strange mountain man who only came down twice a year, having even one person vouch for his character felt like a gift. Finally, in mid-September, the letter had arrived. A woman named Clara Hartwell had accepted his proposal. She would arrive in Briar's Crossing on the 3rd of October, on the afternoon stage from Helena. The agency included a brief description: 22 years old, brown hair, blue eyes, orphaned, currently employed in a textile factory but no photograph. Holt supposed it didn't matter much what she looked like. Beauty faded. Character was what lasted. He'd ridden back up to his cabin with the letter folded carefully in his pocket and his heart beating faster than it had in years. 3 weeks to prepare. 3 weeks until his life changed completely, one way or another. Now here he was, on the 3rd of October, standing at the edge of the crowd, gathered in front of the hotel, watching the stage roll into town in a cloud of dust. His hands were sweating despite the cool autumn air, and his mouth felt dry. He'd worn his best shirt, had even gotten a haircut from the barber that morning, though it hadn't helped much, with the nervous energy coiling in his gut. The stage came to a stop. The driver climbed down and opened the door. And Holt Kincaid's life was about to change forever, though not in any way he could have imagined. Clara Hartwell had been traveling for 11 days, and every mile had taken her farther from everything she'd ever known. The train from Philadelphia to Chicago, another train to Omaha, then the long, bone-rattling stagecoach journey through Nebraska and into Montana territory, where the land grew wilder and the settlements grew smaller until civilization seemed like something she'd only dreamed. She'd spent those 11 days trying not to think too hard about what she was doing, trying not to let the fear swallow her whole. Every time doubt crept in, and it crept in often, she reminded herself of what she was leaving behind. The cramped boarding house room she'd shared with 3 other factory girls. The 14-hour days at the textile mill, breathing lint-filled air until her lungs ached. The constant hunger, the worn-through boots, the bone-deep exhaustion that never quite left. The foreman's wandering hands and knowing smile. The slow realization that this was all her life would ever be, unless she did something drastic. The matrimonial agency had seemed like Providence when she'd seen the advertisement. A way out, a chance at something different. Even if it meant marrying a stranger and traveling 2,000 miles to a place she'd only seen on maps. Her mother would have been horrified. Clara could almost hear her voice, gentle but firm, saying that a lady didn't sell herself like goods at market, that there were other ways, that Clara should have faith. But her mother had been dead for 3 years, taken by pneumonia in the middle of a brutal winter when medicine cost more than they could afford. And her father had died 2 years before that, his lungs destroyed by years of working in the coal dust of the mines back in Pennsylvania. Clara was alone in the world. She had no family, no prospects, and no future worth speaking of. So when she'd seen the letter from Holt Kincaid, awkwardly written but sincere, asking for a companion rather than making grand promises he couldn't keep, she'd said yes before she could talk herself out of it. She'd used the last of her savings to buy a ticket west, everything she owned fit into. One small trunk, a few dresses, her mother's cameo brooch, some undergarments, a worn copy of poetry her father had given her when she was 12. Not much to show for 22 years of living, but it was hers. The journey had been long and uncomfortable, but Clara had barely noticed. She'd been too busy rehearsing conversations in her head, imagining what Holt Kincaid would be like, trying to picture the life that awaited her. She knew better than to expect romance. This was a practical arrangement, nothing more. But she hoped for kindness, for safety, for a place where she could finally catch her breath, and maybe, just maybe, build something that resembled a home. Now, as the stagecoach rattled into Briar's Crossing, those hopes felt fragile as spun glass. Through the dusty window, she could see people gathering in the street, more people than she'd expected. They were staring at the coach, talking among themselves, and something about their expressions made Clara's stomach tighten with anxiety. The driver called out to the horses, and the stage rolled to a stop in front of a 2-story building with a painted sign that read, "Hotel." The sudden stillness, after days of constant motion, felt disorienting. Clara sat frozen in her seat, clutching her small handbag, trying to gather the courage to step outside. "This is your stop, miss," the driver called down. "Briar's Crossing." Clara took a deep breath and reached for the door handle. Her hands were shaking. When she stepped down from the coach, the first thing she noticed was the silence. Conversations died mid-sentence. People stopped what they were doing to stare at her. Clara stood there on the dusty street in her worn brown traveling dress, the best she owned, but clearly shabby by any standard, and felt every pair of eyes taking her measure. She was plain. She knew that. Not ugly, but not pretty either. Thin from years of irregular meals, with brown hair that refused to hold a curl and blue eyes that were her only decent feature. Her dress was clean but faded, patched at the elbows, the hem frayed from too many wearings. Her boots were scuffed and splitting at the seams. She looked exactly like what she was, a poor factory girl who had nothing and was nobody. The whispers started almost immediately. "That's her? That's the mail-order bride? Holt Kincaid sent $9 for that? Poor man. Looks like he got cheated." Clara heard every word. They weren't even trying to be quiet about it. Heat flooded her face, and she dropped her gaze to the ground, wishing she could disappear. The driver was hauling her trunk down from the top of the coach, and she focused on that, trying to block out the voices around her. An older woman in a severe black dress stepped forward, looking Clara up and down with obvious disapproval. "Well," she said loudly, clearly intending to be heard by everyone, "I suppose beggars can't be choosers, even in the marriage market." Laughter rippled through the crowd. Not cruel laughter exactly, but thoughtless, the kind that comes easy when someone else is the target. Clara felt something crack inside her chest. A younger woman, pretty, well-dressed, with blonde curls pinned up fashionably, leaned toward her companion and said in a carrying whisper, $9. Can you imagine? A bargain bride. How desperate do you have to be? More laughter. Clara's vision blurred with tears she refused to let fall. She'd known this wouldn't be easy. She'd known she was taking a risk. But she hadn't expected this to be mocked openly, to be treated like livestock being judged at auction, to have her worth measured in dollars and found wanting. The driver set her trunk on the wooden sidewalk with a thump and tipped his hat to her, his expression sympathetic, but not sympathetic enough to speak up on her behalf. Then he climbed back onto the coach, and within minutes he was gone, leaving Clara standing alone in front of a crowd of strangers who clearly found her amusing. "Where's Kincaid?" someone called out. "Shouldn't he be here to collect his purchase?" "Maybe he took one look and changed his mind," another voice answered, prompting more laughter. Clara wrapped her arms around herself, trying to hold the pieces together. This was a mistake. A terrible mistake. She should have stayed in Philadelphia. At least there, people ignored her instead of mocking her to her face. At least there, she knew what to expect each day, even if it was misery. A man in a black suit and clerical collar stepped forward. The minister, she assumed. He looked uncomfortable, but was clearly trying to fulfill some duty. "Miss Hartwell? I'm Reverend Polk. Mr. Kincaid asked me to, oversee the formalities when you arrived." Formalities. Like she was a package being delivered. Clara nodded, not trusting her voice. "He should be here shortly," the Reverend continued, glancing around nervously. "He was expected to arrive before the stage, but perhaps I'm here." The voice came from the edge of the crowd, deep and rough, but not unkind. Clara looked up and saw a tall man making his way through the gathered townspeople. He was broad-shouldered and weathered, with dark hair and a beard, dressed in simple but clean clothing, homespun shirt, wool vest, work pants, boots. His face was hard to read, his grey eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her want to look away. This was Holt Kincaid, her husband, if she went through with this, the man who'd sent $9 for her like she was a piece of merchandise. The crowd parted for him, and Clara noticed that some of the laughter died down. There was something about his presence, quiet but undeniable, that commanded a certain respect even from people who'd been mocking his choice moments before. He stopped a few feet away from her, and for a long moment they just looked at each other. Clara tried to see judgment in his eyes, tried to find the disappointment she'd heard in the crowd's voices, but his expression was carefully neutral. "Miss Hartwell," he said finally, "I'm Holt Kincaid. Welcome to Briar's Crossing." His voice was gentler than she'd expected, but it didn't help. Nothing could help. The humiliation of the past few minutes had built up inside her like a dam about to break, and his simple courtesy was somehow the final straw. "I'm sorry," she whispered, and her voice broke. "I'm so sorry." She didn't even know what she was apologizing for being plain, for being poor, for not being worth more than $9. For accepting his offer when clearly she was a disappointment to everyone, including probably him. The tears she'd been fighting spilled over, hot tracks down her cheeks. She tried to wipe them away, but they kept coming. Her breath hitched in her throat. She was breaking down in front of the entire town, making a spectacle of herself, but she couldn't stop it. "I know I'm not. I didn't mean to." The words tangled in her mouth. "I understand if you changed your mind. I can work. I can pay you back somehow. I just need—" She couldn't finish. The sobs took over, shaking her whole body. She was vaguely aware of the crowd watching, of the whispers starting again, but she was past caring. She'd never felt so small, so worthless, so utterly alone. Through her tears, she saw Holt Kincaid take a step toward her, then another. She braced herself for anger, for disgust, for him to confirm what everyone else had already said, that she wasn't worth what he'd paid, that he'd made a terrible mistake, that she should get back on the next stage and disappear. Instead, he did something that shocked her into silence. He dropped to one knee right there in the dusty street, in front of God and the entire town. He moved slowly, deliberately, like he was approaching a frightened animal. When he was kneeling before her, his grey eyes level with hers, he reached out and placed one large, calloused hand gently on her shoulder. The touch was careful, respectful, nothing demanding or possessive about it. And then Holt Kincaid began to speak, his rough voice carrying across the sudden silence that had fallen over the crowd. 3 weeks passed on the mountain, and Clara found herself settling into a rhythm she'd never known existed. Each morning began before dawn, when Holt would stoke the fire and put coffee on to boil. The smell would wake her, and she'd emerge from her sleeping area to find him already dressed and preparing for the day's work. They'd share a simple breakfast, usually cornmeal mush or flapjacks with honey, and then Holt would head out to check his trap lines while Clara tackled the domestic tasks. At first, everything had been new and overwhelming. She'd never drawn water from a creek before, never split kindling, never rendered fat for soap or salted meat for preservation. But Holt had been patient despite his earlier warning, showing her each task step by step, and Clara had discovered she was a quick learner. What surprised her most was how much she enjoyed the work. It was hard. Certainly her hands had blistered and then calloused, her back ached by evening, and she fell into bed exhausted most nights. But it was honest work, with visible results. When she hauled water, they had water to drink and cook with. When she mended clothes, they had clothes that kept them warm. When she preserved the last of the garden vegetables, they had food for winter. Every task mattered in a way factory work never had. Holt had started teaching her other skills too. How to build and maintain a fire properly, how to identify edible plants, how to read the weather by watching the sky and the behavior of animals. He'd even begun teaching her to shoot, taking her out behind the cabin with his rifle and showing her how to hold it, how to sight down the barrel, how to squeeze the trigger instead of jerking it. Living up here, you need to know how to protect yourself, he'd said seriously. Bears mostly leave people alone, but mountain lions can be trouble. And if I'm ever hurt or sick, you need to be able to hunt for food. The first time Clara had fired the rifle, the recoil had knocked her back a step and left her shoulder aching. But by the end of the first week of practice, she could hit a target more often than not. Holt had looked genuinely pleased, which had made Clara feel a ridiculous surge of pride. They talked more as the days went on, small conversations at first, about practical things, what needed doing, what the weather looked like, how the trap lines were producing. But gradually, the conversations deepened. Clara found herself sharing stories about her childhood in Pennsylvania, about her parents and the hard-scrabble life they'd led. About her mother's gentle faith and her father's stubborn determination to provide for his family, despite the coal dust slowly killing him. Holt listened without judgment, asking questions that showed he was genuinely interested, and slowly, carefully, he began sharing his own history. He told her about growing up on the ranch in Wyoming, about learning to track from his father and to read from his mother. About his sister Lily, who'd been 10 years old when she died, full of laughter and mischief. She would have liked you, he said one evening, as they sat by the fire, Clara working on mending one of his shirts, while Holt carved a new handle for an axe. She always said I was too serious, that I needed someone to make me laugh more. Do I make you laugh? Clara asked, surprised. Holt looked up from his carving, and there was warmth in his grey eyes. You make me smile, which is close enough. Haven't done much of that in recent years. Clara felt heat creep into her cheeks and focused intently on her mending. The trip to town for supplies came at the end of the third week. Clara had been both anticipating and dreading it, unsure how the expected townspeople would treat her after the scene at her arrival. But she needed fabric for a new dress, her traveling clothes were wearing thin, and Holt needed to trade his pelts and pick up supplies before winter set in properly. They rode down the mountain in the wagon, and Clara found herself noticing details she'd missed on the way up. The way the aspens had turned gold, their leaves shimmering in the breeze. The clear, cold streams that crossed the road in several places. The vastness of the sky, bigger than anything she'd known in Philadelphia. It's beautiful here, she said softly. Holt glanced at her, a slight smile tugging at his mouth. It is. Never gets old, seeing it fresh through someone else's eyes. Briar's Crossing looked different in the afternoon light, less threatening than it had from the stagecoach. When they pulled up in front of the general store, Clara noticed a few people glancing their way, but the cruel speculation from before was absent. If anything, people seemed curious. Sarah Miller emerged from the store as they were climbing down from the wagon, and her face lit up with genuine pleasure. Clara, I was hoping you'd come to town soon. She hurried over, clasping Clara's hands warmly. How are you? How's the cabin? Are you settling in all right? The rapid-fire questions made Clara smile. I'm well, thank you. The cabin is lovely, and yes, I'm settling in. She's been a natural," Holt added quietly, and Clara felt a warm glow at the praise. Sarah beamed at them both. "I'm so glad. Listen, would you have time for tea? There's a little restaurant next to the hotel, nothing fancy, but Margaret Hayes makes a decent pot of tea, and her biscuits are the best in the territory." Clara glanced at Holt, who nodded. "I'll be a while at the trading post anyway. Go ahead." The restaurant was small but clean, with checkered tablecloths and windows that looked out onto the main street. Margaret Hayes, the same woman who'd made the cutting remarks at Clara's arrival, stood behind a counter. When she saw Clara enter with Sarah, something shifted in her expression. Not quite friendliness, but not hostility either. "Mrs. Miller, Mrs. Kincaid," she said, nodding to each of them. Clara opened her mouth to correct the assumption she wasn't Mrs. Kincaid yet, but Sarah spoke first. "Tea for two, please, Margaret, and some of those biscuits if you have any." As they settled at a table by the window, Sarah leaned forward conspiratorially. "Don't mind Margaret, she's sharp-tongued, but her bark's worse than her bite. She's already been telling people she knew Holt Kincaid was a gentleman all along." "She called me a bargain bride," Clara said quietly. "She did, and she was wrong to do it." Sarah's voice was firm. "But what Holt did, kneeling like that, giving you a choice, it changed how people see both of you. You should know that. People are talking about it, but in a good way, saying Holt Kincaid's got more honor in his little finger than most men have in their whole bodies." Clara felt emotion tighten her throat. "He does." Sarah studied her with knowing eyes. "You care about him." It wasn't a question, but Clara answered anyway. "I'm starting to." "Is that foolish? It's only been 3 weeks. Foolish? No." Sarah smiled gently. "Sometimes you just know. I knew I loved John after 2 weeks, and we've been married 5 years now, and it still feels right." She paused. "Though I will say, taking your time isn't a bad thing either. You're being smart, making sure this is what you want." The tea arrived, along with biscuits that were indeed excellent. As they ate and talked, Clara found herself opening up to Sarah in a way she hadn't with anyone in years. Sarah was easy to talk to, warm and funny and refreshingly honest about the challenges of frontier life. "It's not easy," Sarah admitted. "Winters are long and sometimes lonely. The work never stops, and there are days when I miss city. Things, theater, libraries, streets with names instead of just the road. But then John comes home and smiles at me like I'm the best thing in his whole world, and I remember why I chose this life." "Did you come out as a mail-order bride too?" Clara asked. "No, I came with my family on a wagon train. We were heading to Oregon, but when we stopped here for supplies, I met John and decided Montana Territory was close enough." Sarah grinned. "My parents about had fits, but they came around eventually, especially after they met John properly. They talked for another hour, and by the time Clara returned to the general store to find Holt, she felt lighter than she had in weeks. She'd made a friend, a real friend, not just someone to work alongside in silence. Holt was loading supplies into the wagon, and his face brightened slightly when he saw her approach. "Good visit?" "Very good," Clara confirmed. On the way back up the mountain, with the wagon full of flour and salt and coffee and the fabric Clara had chosen for her new dress, Holt cleared his throat. "Sarah Miller's good people," he said. "Her husband too. I'm glad you're making friends." "So am I." Clara hesitated, then added, "People seem different toward us now. Less judgmental." "People talk," Holt said with a slight shrug, "but I suppose if they're going to talk anyway, might as well give them something worthwhile to say." That evening, as they sat by the fire after supper, Clara worked on cutting out the pieces for her new dress, while Holt worked on his eternal carving projects. The easy domesticity of it struck her suddenly how natural it felt to be here with him, to share this space and these quiet hours. "Holt," she said softly. He looked up from his work. "Thank you." Clara said. "For everything, for giving me time, for teaching me, for being patient." "Nothing to thank me for," Holt replied, but his eyes were warm. "You've held up your end and then some. Cabin's never been cleaner, and you cook better than I ever managed." They smiled at each other across the firelight, and Clara felt something shift between them. Not dramatic or sudden, but real. A deepening of the connection that had been growing since the day he'd knelt before her in the dusty street. The first snow came in early November, transforming the mountain overnight. Clara woke to a hushed world, everything muffled and white. From the cabin window, she could see the clearing blanketed in pristine snow that sparkled in the weak morning light. Holt was already up, as usual, feeding the fire. When he noticed her standing at the window, he came to stand beside her. "Beautiful, isn't it?" he said quietly. "I've never seen so much snow," Clara admitted. "In Philadelphia it snowed, but it always turned to grey slush within hours. This is different. It'll stay like this until spring now," Holt said. "Gets deeper as winter goes on. Sometimes up to the cabin's eaves by January." The thought, he should have been frightening, being truly isolated for months, but instead, Clara felt a strange sense of peace. She glanced up at Holt's profile and found him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "What?" she asked softly. "Just thinking how different things are from what I expected," he said. "When I sent that letter east, I was thinking about survival, having someone to help with the work, someone to talk to so the winters didn't feel so long. But you've become—" He paused, searching for words. "More than that. You've made this place feel like a home instead of just a shelter." Clara's heart fluttered in her chest. "You've given me more than shelter, too. You've given me a place where I can breathe, where I don't have to be afraid all the time." They stood close together in the weak morning light, and Clara was acutely aware of the small distance between them. It would be easy to close that gap, to lean into his warmth, to finally acknowledge what had been, building between them for weeks now. But something held her back, not fear exactly, but a lingering uncertainty. She cared for Holt, cared deeply, if she was honest with herself, but was it real affection or just gratitude? How could she trust her own feelings when they'd developed under such unusual circumstances? The moment passed, and Holt stepped back to check the coffee. Clara returned to her sleeping area to dress, her thoughts churning. That night, after Holt had gone to bed, Clara sat by the dying fire with a piece of paper and a pencil she'd bought in town. She hadn't written anything personal since leaving Philadelphia, but suddenly she felt the need to put her confused feelings into words, even if no one would ever read them. She began to write, "Dear Mama, I know you can't hear me, but I need to talk to someone, and you always understood me best. I'm in Montana Territory now, living in a cabin on a mountain with a man named Holt Kincaid. He's nothing like what I expected when I agreed to come west. He's kind and patient and respectful in ways I didn't know men could be. And Mama, I think I'm falling in love with him. But I'm scared. How do I know if what I feel is real? How do I know I'm not just grateful to him for giving me a better life than the factory? How do I trust this feeling when everything happened so fast? You always told me that real love feels like coming home, like finding a place where you can be fully yourself. I think maybe that's what this is, but I'm afraid to believe it. What if I'm wrong? What if I let myself love him, and it turns out to be something less than what I hope?" She folded the letter carefully and tucked it into the bottom of the wooden box Holt had made for her beneath her mother's cameo brooch. Writing the words hadn't solved anything, but it had clarified her feelings. She did love him, or at least, she was falling in love with him. The question was, what to do about it? Over the next few days, the snow continued to fall intermittently, and the cabin became an increasingly intimate space. Holt still checked his trap lines, but the trips were shorter now, and they spent more time together in the cabin's warm confines. Clara had found Holt's mother's unfinished wedding quilt in a trunk, carefully wrapped in muslin. When she'd asked about it, Holt had explained that his mother had started it years ago, but never finished before she died. She always said a home wasn't complete without a proper quilt, he'd said, touching the fabric gently. But I never had reason to finish it myself. Clara had asked if she could work on it, and Holt had agreed. Now, in the long winter evenings, she sat by the fire with the quilt spread across her lap, adding stitches to the intricate pattern. It felt meaningful somehow, completing something Holt's mother had started, creating something beautiful for the home she was beginning to think of as hers. She caught Holt watching her sometimes as she worked, his expression thoughtful and soft, in a way that made her pulse quicken. One evening, as a storm howled outside, and they sat especially close to share the warmth of the fire, Clara looked up from her stitching to find Holt's eyes on her again. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. Holt was quiet for a long moment. "About how I was afraid you'd leave," he said finally. "When you first arrived, when you saw how isolated the cabin was, how hard the life would be, I thought you'd take the first chance to go back east. But you stayed." "I want to be here," Clara said. And it was the truth. "Do you?" Holt's voice was almost hesitant. "Or do you feel like you should stay because you don't have anywhere else to go?" It was the same question Clara had been asking herself, and now she had an answer. "Both were true at first," she admitted. "But that's not why I'm staying now. I'm staying because when I'm here with you, I feel like I'm where I'm supposed to be. Does that make sense?" Holt's hand moved slowly, giving her plenty of time to pull away if she wanted. When she didn't, his fingers brushed against hers, where they rested on the quilt. The touch was tentative, questioning. Clara turned her hand over, lacing her fingers with his. His hand was rough and calloused, warm and strong. It felt right. They sat like that for a long time, hands clasped, watching the fire burn down. Neither of them spoke, but words weren't necessary. Something fundamental had shifted between them, an acknowledgement of what was growing between them. When the fire had burned to embers and the cold was creeping in despite their proximity to the hearth, Holt reluctantly released her hand. "We should get some sleep," he said softly. Clara nodded, but as she stood to go to her sleeping area, she turned back. "Holt," he looked up at her. "I'm glad I came here. I'm glad it was you who sent that letter." His smile was slow but genuine, reaching his eyes in a way that transformed his entire face. "So am I, Clara. So am I." That night, Clara lay in her bed, listening to the storm outside and the quiet sounds of Holt settling in on the other side of the cabin. Her hand still tingled where he'd held it, and her heart felt full of something she was no longer afraid to name. She was falling in love with Holt Kincaid. And she was beginning to believe that he might be falling in love with her too. 2 days after the first heavy snowfall, Clara heard the sound of a horse approaching the cabin. It was unusual. Holt wasn't expecting anyone, and most people didn't venture this far up the mountain unless they had pressing business. She looked up from the bread dough she was kneading to see Holt already moving toward the rifle he kept by the door. But when the rider came into view through the window, Holt relaxed slightly. It was Sheriff Brennan, and there was another man with him, someone Clara didn't recognize. This second man was well dressed for the frontier, in a wool suit and overcoat that marked him as someone from back east. He sat his horse awkwardly, like someone unaccustomed to riding. Holt opened the door as they dismounted. "Tom, what brings you up here in this weather?" "Sorry to intrude, Holt," Sheriff Brennan said, stamping snow from his boots. "This is Edmund Price. He's a lawyer from Philadelphia. Been asking around town about Mrs. Hartwell. Figured I should bring him up here rather than have him try to find the place himself and freeze to death in the process." Clara's hands stilled on the dough. A lawyer from Philadelphia? Looking for her? A chill that had nothing to do with the weather ran down her spine. "Mrs. Hartwell?" the lawyer said, turning to Clara with obvious relief. "Thank goodness. I've been searching for you for months." "Searching for me?" Clara's voice came out smaller than she intended. "Why? Perhaps we should discuss this inside," Sheriff Brennan suggested, glancing at Holt. They all moved into the cabin, and Clara quickly wiped the flour from her hands, her mind racing with possibilities. Had something happened to someone she knew? Was she in some kind of trouble? She couldn't imagine what a lawyer would want with her. Edmund Price removed his hat and accepted the chair Holt offered him near the fire. He pulled a leather satchel from under his coat and extracted several official-looking documents. "Mrs. Hartwell," he began, then corrected himself. "Or is it Mrs. Kincaid now?" "Hartwell," Clara said quietly. "We haven't, that is, we're not yet." She felt her face heat with embarrassment. "Miss Hartwell, then?" Price said smoothly, as if this kind of ambiguous situation was something he encountered regularly. "I represent the law firm of Morrison and Price in Philadelphia. We've been trying to locate you for some time regarding a matter of inheritance." "Inheritance?" Clara sank into the chair Holt had pulled up for her. "That's not possible. I don't have any family left." "Not immediate family?" "No," Price agreed. "But your late father, Thomas Hartwell, filed a land claim in Montana Territory approximately 10 years ago when he was working as a surveyor for a railroad company." Clara stared at him. "My father was a coal miner." "He was, for most of his life. But before that, in his younger years, he worked as a surveyor's assistant. The position took him west for about 2 years, from 1862 to 1864. During that time, he filed a claim on 160 acres of land under the Homestead Act." Price spread a map across the small table. "The land is here, in Montana Territory, about 3 miles from where we're sitting right now, actually." Holt leaned forward, studying the map with suddenly intense interest. Clara recognized the landmarks: Briar's Crossing, the mountain range, the creek that ran through the valley. And there, marked in careful surveyor's notation, was a plot of land that bordered directly on Holt's property. "I don't understand," Clara said slowly. "If my father owned land here, why did we never come? Why did he go back to the mines?" "According to our research, your father intended to bring his family west once he'd saved enough money," Price explained. "But your mother became ill during that period, and medical bills consumed their savings. By the time she recovered, your father had given up on the dream and returned to mining because it paid better than surveying work. He never returned to Montana Territory, and eventually, I suspect, he simply forgot about the claim." Clara tried to process this. Her father had owned land in Montana Territory, land she'd never known existed, in a place she'd come to by pure chance, or what she'd thought was chance. "Why are you telling me this now?" she asked. Price's expression became serious. "Because 6 months ago, a mineral survey was conducted in this region. Your father's land, your land now, as his heir sits directly above a mineral side, significant silver deposit. Not a massive vein, but substantial enough that several mining companies have expressed interest in purchasing the property." The cabin went very quiet. Clara could hear the fire crackling, the wind outside, her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. "How much?" Holt asked, his voice carefully neutral. "The current offers range from $15,000 to $20,000, Price said. "Though I believe with proper negotiation we could get considerably more. $20,000. Clara couldn't even conceive of that much money. It was more than she could earn in several lifetimes of factory work. It was wealth beyond anything she'd ever imagined. "I've brought the necessary documents," Price continued, pulling more papers from his satchel. "The deed to the land, proof of your father's claim, verification of your identity as his heir. Everything is in order. All you need to do is sign the transfer of ownership from your father's name to yours, and then we can proceed with the sale. I have buyers standing by who are ready to make immediate offers." He pulled out a pen and set it on top of the papers. "I know this must be overwhelming, Miss Hartwell. Take whatever time you need, though I should mention that I can only remain in the territory for about a week before I need to return to Philadelphia. The buyers are anxious to move forward." Clara looked at the papers at the pen, at the lawyer who was watching her expectantly. $20,000. Enough money to go anywhere, do anything. She could return to Philadelphia and live comfortably for the rest of her life. She could travel. She could have security, real security, for the first time since her parents died. She glanced at Holt and found him watching her with an expression she couldn't read. His jaw was tight, his hands clenched on his knees. "Could you give us a moment?" Clara asked Price. "To discuss this privately?" "Of course," Price said, rising. "I'll wait outside, with Sheriff Brennan. Take your time." Once the door closed behind them, silence filled the cabin. Clara and Holt stared at each other across the small space. "You should take it," Holt said finally, his voice rough. "What?" "The money. The land. You should sell it." He stood abruptly, pacing to the window. $20,000, Clara. That's a fortune. That's security for the rest of your life. You'd never have to worry about money again. Never have to work yourself to exhaustion. Never have to... He stopped himself. "Never have to live in a cabin on a mountain with a trapper?" Clara finished softly. Holt's shoulders tensed. "That's not what I was going to say." "Wasn't it?" Clara stood, her own emotions churning. "You're telling me to take the money and leave. That's what you mean." "I'm telling you to take the opportunity you've been given," Holt said, still not turning to look at her. "To not throw away a chance at a better life because you feel obligated to stay. Here, obligated?" Clara's voice rose. "Is that what you think? That I'm only here out of obligation?" "I don't know," Holt said, and now he did turn, and Clara could see the pain in his eyes. "How can either of us know? You came here because you had nowhere else to go. Now you do. Now you have choices, real choices. And I won't be the thing that keeps you from taking them." Clara felt tears burning behind her eyes. "You gave me a choice once before. Remember? In town, when you knelt before me and told me I wasn't obligated to you, you gave me the freedom to decide for myself what I wanted. This is different. How? How is it different? Because now there's..." Holt stopped, running a hand through his hair in frustration. "Because things have changed between us. And I won't have you stay because you think you owe me something, or because you feel sorry for me, or because you've convinced yourself you care about me, when what you really care about is having a place to belong." The words hit Clara like a physical blow. "Is that what you think? That I don't really care about you?" Holt's silence was answer enough. Clara crossed the cabin until she was standing directly in front of him. "I held your hand 2 nights ago. I told you I felt like this was where I was supposed to be. Was I lying? Were you lying when you held my hand back?" "No," Holt said quietly, "but we've known each other less than 2 months, Clara. How can we trust what we feel when everything happened so fast, when you came here out of desperation? What if you take this money, go back east, and realize that what you felt was just gratitude, just relief at being rescued from a bad situation? And what if I stay, and you spend the rest of our lives wondering if I only stayed because I felt I had to?" Clara countered, "Is that what you want? To always question whether I chose you, or whether I simply had no better option?" The question hung in the air between them. Outside, Clara could hear Sheriff Brennan and Price talking in low voices, stamping their feet to keep warm while they waited. "I don't know what I want," Holt admitted finally, his voice raw. "I thought I did. I thought I wanted you to stay, wanted us to build a life together. But now you have a chance at something better, and I won't be selfish enough to ask you to give that up." "Even if it's what I want to give up?" Clara asked. "Especially then," Holt said, "because I care about you too much to let you make that choice without being absolutely certain." Clara felt tears spill over and run down her cheeks. "So what are you saying? That I should take the money and leave?" "I'm saying you should take the week Price is offering. Use that time to really think about what you want. Not what you think I want, not what you think you should want, what you actually want for your life." "And us?" Clara whispered. Holt looked at her with such longing and such pain that it broke her heart. If you come back, if you choose this life after having real options, then we'll know it's real. Both of us will know. And if I don't come back? Holt's jaw tightened and he looked away. Then I'll know I did the right thing by letting you go. Clara wanted to argue, wanted to tell him this was ridiculous, that she'd already made her choice. But doubt crept in. Was she certain? Could she honestly say she knew her own heart when everything had happened so quickly, when she'd come here with nothing and now had the possibility of everything? She wiped her tears and straightened her shoulders. All right, she said quietly. I'll think about it. I'll take the week. Holt nodded, not trusting himself to speak. Clara walked to the door and opened it, letting in the cold air and the two men waiting outside. Mr. Price, I need time to consider your offer. A week, as you suggested. Price looked pleased. Of course, Miss Hartwell. Shall I arrange accommodation for you in town? It might be easier to review the documents there, and I can answer any questions you might have. Clara glanced back at Holt, who was staring into the fire with his back to her. Yes, she said, her heart breaking. I'll come to town with you. Clara spent the week in Briar's Crossing at the small hotel, and it was the longest week of her life. Edmund Price had set her up in the best room they had, which wasn't saying much by Philadelphia standards, but it was clean and comfortable. He'd advanced her $50 against the eventual sale, insisting she buy herself proper clothes and anything else she needed. The money felt strange in her hands. She'd never held so much at once, and the weight of it seemed symbolic somehow. This was just a fraction of what she'd have if she sold the land, and already it was more than she'd ever imagined possessing. She bought a new dress, better quality than anything she'd owned before. She bought good boots, a warm coat, undergarments that weren't patched and mended. She bought small luxuries, a bar of scented soap, a proper hairbrush, a book to read. Each purchase felt both thrilling and wrong, like she was trying on someone else's life. Sarah Miller visited every day, bringing food from the restaurant and sitting with Clara while she worked through her confusion. I don't know what to do, Clara admitted on the third day, sitting by the window of her hotel room and staring out at the mountains where Holt's cabin was hidden somewhere in the trees. Part of me wants to sell everything and go back east, start fresh with money in my pocket and no obligations. But the other part wants to stay with Holt, Sarah finished gently. Clara nodded miserably. But how do I know which part is real? What if Holt's right? What if I only think I love him because he gave me an escape from the factory? Sarah was quiet for a moment, stirring her tea thoughtfully. Can I tell you something? When I decided to stay here instead of going to Oregon, with my family, everyone told me I was making a mistake. They said I was too young, that I barely knew John, that I was throwing away my future for a man I'd known less than a month. And maybe they were right to worry. But I knew here. She pressed her hand to her heart. I knew that if I got on that wagon and left, I'd spend the rest of my life wondering what might have been. But you didn't have money, Clara pointed out. You didn't have other options. I had options, Sarah said firmly. I could have gone to Oregon and made a good life there. Could have met someone else eventually, maybe someone with more money or better prospects than a shopkeeper in a tiny frontier town. But I didn't want options. I wanted John. There's a difference. Clara absorbed this, turning it over in her mind. The question isn't whether you could have a good life somewhere else with that money, Sarah continued. The question is whether you'd be happy, whether you'd wake up every morning and feel like you were where you belonged, or whether you'd always have this hollow place inside where Holt used to be. That night, Clara lay awake in her hotel bed, far more comfortable than the one in Holt's cabin, and tried to imagine her future. She pictured herself in Philadelphia, in a nice boarding house, maybe even a small apartment of her own. She'd never have to work in the factory again. She could take classes, learn a trade, maybe even open a small shop of her own. She could have friends, culture, all the things a city offered that the frontier couldn't. The image should have been appealing. Instead, it felt empty. She thought about the cabin, about the way the morning light came through the windows, about the smell of coffee and wood smoke, about Holt's quiet presence across the table at breakfast. She thought about the work hard but meaningful, and the way her hands had grown strong and capable. She thought about finishing the wedding quilt, about holding Holt's hand by the fire, about the way he looked at her like she was something precious, and she knew. She'd known all along, really, but she'd needed the time to be certain, to examine her feelings from every angle and make sure they were real. She loved Holt Kincaid, not because he'd rescued her, not because she felt obligated, not because she had no better options. She loved him because of who he was, his quiet strength, his unexpected gentleness, his commitment to doing right, even when it cost him. She loved the life they were building together, the partnership they'd formed. She loved the way he made her feel safe and valued and seen. $20,000 couldn't buy what she had with Holt, and she didn't want it to, but there was still a problem. Even if she was certain of her feelings, Holt had made his position clear. He didn't want her to choose him unless she was absolutely sure, unless she'd had time to consider every alternative. He'd been willing to let her go to prove that her choice was real. Well, she'd taken the time. She'd considered the alternatives. Now she needed to show him that her choice was real, and she needed to do it in a way that left no doubt in either of their minds. On the 7th day, Edmund Price knocked on her door with final papers for her to review. The offers had been refined, and the highest was now $22,000 from a mining consortium based out of Denver. "It's an excellent offer," Price said, spreading the documents across the small table in her room. "I doubt we could get significantly better, and the buyers are ready to close immediately. If you sign today, I can have a bank draft for you within 48 hours. Clara looked at the papers, at the number written in careful script. $22,000. A fortune that would change her entire life. "Mr. Price," she said slowly, "this land that my father claimed, what would happen to it if I didn't sell?" Price looked surprised. "Well, it would remain yours. You could develop it yourself, though I should warn you that mining operations require significant capital investment. Or you could simply hold on to it, pay the property taxes, and potentially sell later when the value increases. Could I give it away?" "Give it away?" Price blinked. "To whom? To someone who lives adjacent to the property, someone who could use the land for ranching instead of mining." Price studied her carefully. "You mean Mr. Kincaid?" "Yes, Miss Hartwell. I must advise you that this would be an extraordinarily generous gift. The land is worth a significant sum." "Are you certain you've thought this through?" Clara smiled, and for the first time all week she felt completely at peace. "I'm certain. How would I go about transferring the deed?" Price pulled out different papers, these ones dealing with property transfer rather than sale. As Clara signed the documents that would give the land to Holt, she felt a weight lift from her shoulders. This was right. This was the answer to all the doubt and uncertainty. She wasn't choosing Holt because she had no other options. She was choosing him freely, deliberately, even when it meant giving up a fortune. And now he would know that too. After Price left, promising to file the papers and return to Philadelphia, Clara went to find Sarah. She needed help with one more thing. "I need to borrow your wagon," Clara said, "and I need you to help me with something at the general store." Sarah's eyes lit up with understanding. "You're going back to him?" "I'm going back to him," Clara confirmed, "but not empty-handed." At the general store, Clara used some of the $50. Price had advanced her money she insisted on treating as a loan that she'd pay back through work to purchase supplies. Not practical supplies like flour and coffee, though she got those too, but also small luxuries, real sugar, dried fruit, a tin of good tobacco for Holt, new fabric for curtains, and most importantly, the materials she'd need for what she planned to do when she got to the cabin. John Miller helped load everything into the wagon, and Sarah insisted on driving Clara up the mountain herself. "I want to see the look on Holt's face," Sarah said with a grin. The ride up to the cabin felt different than it had the first time. Then, Clara had been nervous and uncertain. Now, she was coming home. When the cabin came into view through the trees, Clara's heart started pounding. There was smoke coming from the chimney, and she could see fresh tracks in the snow where Holt had been working. The place looked exactly the same as when she'd left it a week ago, but somehow it looked more precious, more valuable than any amount of money could make it. Sarah pulled the wagon to a stop, and Clara climbed down, her legs shaky with nerves and anticipation. The cabin door opened, and Holt stepped out. He looked thinner than he had a week ago, and there were dark circles under his eyes. Like he hadn't been sleeping well. When he saw Clara, he froze. "Clara," he said, his voice rough. "What are you doing here?" "I needed to talk to you," Clara said, walking toward him with her heart in her throat. "Can we go inside?" Holt nodded wordlessly and held the door open. Sarah gave Clara an encouraging smile and stayed with the wagon. Inside, the cabin was exactly as Clara remembered, except somehow sadder. The fire was burning, but the place felt empty, like it had been waiting for her to return. The wedding quilt was still spread across her sleeping area, unfinished, exactly where she'd left it. "You came back," Holt said, standing awkwardly in the middle of the room, like he didn't know what to do with himself. "I came back," Clara confirmed. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a folded document. "I wanted to give you this." Holt took the paper, unfolding it carefully. Clara watched his face as he read, saw the exact moment he understood what he was looking at. "This is the deed to your father's land," he said slowly. "Transferred into my name. Yes. Clara, you can't. This land is worth a fortune. You can't just give it away." "I didn't give it away," Clara said firmly. "I gave it to you. There's a difference." "Why?" Holt's voice was anguished. "Why would you do this?" Clara stepped closer to him, close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his grey eyes, close enough to reach up and place her hand on his chest where she could feel his heart beating fast. "Because you asked me to take a week and decide what I really wanted," she said softly. "So I did. I thought about going back to Philadelphia. I thought about having money and security and all the things I never had before. And then I thought about you, about this cabin, about the life we were building together. And I realized that none of that other stuff mattered if I didn't have this, if I didn't have you." "Clara, I'm not finished," she interrupted, gently. "You were worried that I was only staying because I felt obligated or because I had nowhere else to go. So I'm showing you that's not true. I had somewhere else to go. I had money and options and a whole different life I could have chosen. And I'm choosing this instead. I'm choosing you. Not because I have to, because I want to." Holt's hand came up to cover hers where it rested on his chest. "You gave up a fortune. I gave up money," Clara corrected. "I didn't give up anything that matters. What if you regret it? What if I don't?" Clara countered. "Holt, I love you. I'm in love with you. And I'm not afraid of that anymore." When Holt and Clara emerged from the cabin, hand in hand, Sarah took one look at their faces and let out a whoop of joy that probably echoed all the way down to Briar's Crossing. "You're getting married," she exclaimed, jumping down from the wagon seat. "I knew it. I told John you two were meant for each other." Clara laughed, feeling lighter than she had in years. "We need to get to town. Can we all fit in the wagon?" "We'll make it work," Sarah said, already moving to help load the supplies Clara had brought. "Oh, this is wonderful. We need to tell everyone. Margaret Hayes is going to have to eat her words about bargain brides." The ride down the mountain was joyful chaos. Sarah kept up a constant stream of chatter about wedding plans, about who would need to be invited, about what Clara should wear. Holt sat close to Clara on the wagon seat, his hand never leaving hers, occasionally looking at her like he still couldn't quite believe this was real. "I need to stop at the cabin first," Clara said as they approached town. "I left something there, the wedding quilt. It's finished, or it will be by tonight." "You finished it?" Holt's voice was soft with emotion. "Almost. Just a few more stitches. I wanted it to be complete before." Clara stopped, her cheeks warming. "Before we got married." Holt raised her hand to fore, his lips, and kissed her knuckles gently, a gesture that made Sarah sigh happily from her position managing the reins. By the time they reached Briar's Crossing, the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. Sarah drove straight to the church, where Reverend Polk was just locking up for the evening. "Reverend," Sarah called out, "we need you." The Reverend turned, his eyebrows rising in surprise as he took in the sight of Holt and Clara together, both of them flushed and bright-eyed. A slow smile spread across his face. "Well now," he said warmly, "I take it Miss Hartwell made her decision." "I did," Clara said, squeezing Holt's hand. "And we'd like to get married. Tonight, if possible. Tomorrow at the latest." "Tonight?" The Reverend looked startled, then thoughtful. "Well, I suppose there's no reason to wait, is there? You've had plenty of time to consider. Let me fetch my wife to serve as a witness, and we can perform the ceremony right now, if you'd like." "Right now would be perfect," Holt said. While Reverend Polk went to get his wife, Sarah insisted on running to the general store to spread the word. Within 20 minutes, it seemed like half the town had gathered at the small church. Sheriff Brennan and his wife were there, looking pleased. John Miller had closed the store to attend. Even Margaret Hayes showed up, though she stood at the back, looking like she'd swallowed something sour. Clara stood at the front of the church in her new dress, the one she'd bought with Price's advance money, and felt Holt's solid presence beside her. She thought about the first time she'd stood in this town, humiliated and crying, believing she was worthless. And now, here she was, about to marry a man who'd shown her she was priceless. Reverend Polk opened his Bible and began the familiar words of the marriage ceremony. Clara barely heard them, too focused on Holt's face, on the way he was looking at her like she'd hung the moon and stars just for him. When it came time for vows, Holt cleared his throat and spoke clearly, his rough voice carrying through the small church. "I, Holt Kincaid, take you, Clara Hartwell, to be my wife. I promise to honor you, to respect your choices, to stand beside you through whatever comes. I promise to love you not because you're obligated to me, but because you chose me freely. That choice is the greatest gift I've ever received, and I'll spend the rest of my life being worthy of it." Clara's eyes filled with tears, happy ones this time. When it was her turn, she spoke from her heart. "I, Clara Hartwell, take you, Holt Kincaid, to be my husband. I promise to build a life with you, to be your partner in all things, to love you not because you rescued me, but because you saw me as worth rescuing. You gave me dignity when the world took it away. You gave me choice when I thought I had none. And you gave me a home, not just a place to live, but a place where I could finally be myself. I choose you, today and every day after." Reverend Polk smiled through his own tears. "By the power vested in me by the Montana Territory, I now pronounce you husband and wife." "Holt, you may kiss your bride." Holt cupped Clara's face in his hands with infinite gentleness and kissed her as the small church erupted in applause and cheers. When they broke apart, both of them were crying and laughing at the same time. "Mrs. Kincaid," Holt whispered against her lips. "Mr. Kincaid," Clara replied, and kissed him again. Sheriff Brennan stepped forward with a small box. "Almost forgot. Had this made for you down in Helena. Was going to give it to you whenever you two finally figured things out." Inside the box were 2 simple gold wedding bands, nothing fancy, but solid and real. Holt slipped one onto Clara's finger, and she slipped the other onto his. and they stood there admiring them like they were the most precious jewels in the world. Sarah was crying openly now, and several other women in the congregation were dabbing at their eyes. Even Margaret Hayes looked almost approving, though she'd probably never admit it. As they walked out of the church together, husband and wife, the whole town followed them out into the twilight. Someone had apparently run to the saloon because music started playing and people began to dance right there in the street. "Guess we're having a celebration," Holt said, pulling Clara close. "Guess we are," Clara agreed, resting her head on his chest. They danced under the stars, surrounded by people who'd once mocked them but now celebrated their union. And Clara thought about how far she'd come from a frightened factory girl to a woman who knew her own worth, who'd chosen love over money, who'd found home in the most unexpected place. "Ready to go back to the mountain?" Holt asked, when the celebration finally wound down hours later. "Ready to go home," Clara corrected, and hand in hand they climbed into the noosh wagon for the journey back to the cabin where their life together would truly begin. 6 months later, spring arrived on the mountain like a promise kept. The snow melted in earnest, revealing the brown earth beneath, and the first brave shoots of green pushing up through the softening ground. The creek ran high and fast with snowmelt, and the air carried the scent of pine sap and new growth. Clara stood on the porch of the cabin, their cabin now, expanded over the winter months, with an additional room that Holt had built, and watched the valley below come back to life. Her hand rested on the slight swell of her belly, where their child grew steadily. They'd discovered the pregnancy in February, during one of the long, snowed-in weeks, and the joy of it had carried them through the rest of the winter. Inside, she could hear Holt moving around, preparing breakfast. He'd become even more solicitous since learning about the baby, insisting she rest more, worrying that she was working too hard. Clara found it endearing, even when she had to remind him that she wasn't made of glass. The sound of a wagon drew her attention. Sarah and John Miller were making their way up the mountain, their first visit since the snow had cleared enough to make the journey safe. Clara waved, and Sarah waved back enthusiastically. "I brought food," Sarah called as soon as they were close enough, "and news from town, and I want to see how much the baby's grown." Clara laughed and went inside to tell Holt they had visitors. He came out onto the porch, wiping his hands on a cloth, and helped John unload supplies from the wagon. Over breakfast, which had turned into an impromptu feast with Sarah's contributions, they caught up on all the news. The town was growing, with 3 new families having arrived over the winter. A proper school was being built, which would open in the fall. And most importantly, Sarah herself was expecting, due in September. "We'll raise them together," Sarah said, squeezing Clara's hand across the table. "Our children will grow up as friends, just like us." After the meal, while Holt and John walked the property discussing plans for spring planting, Sarah helped Clara work on the garden plot. They decided to expand it significantly this year, using some of the land that had been Clara's father's. The silver deposit remained untouched. They had no interest in mining, and the land was far more valuable to them as grazing and farming space. "Are you happy?" Sarah asked as they worked, the question simple but sincere. Clara sat back on her heels, considering. She thought about the past 6 months, the long winter nights by the fire with Holt, learning to cook together, reading aloud from books they'd ordered from Helena, planning for the baby. She thought about the quiet companionship that had deepened into something richer than she'd ever imagined possible. She thought about waking up every morning next to a man who looked at her like she was a miracle, and knowing that she looked at him the same way. "I'm happier than I ever thought possible," she said honestly. "Sometimes I think about what my life would have been like if I'd sold that land and gone back to Philadelphia, and I can't even imagine it. This is where I belong." Sarah smiled, understanding completely. "That's how I feel too, about John, about this place. It's not always easy, but it's real. It matters, That evening, after Sarah and John had left and the cabin was quiet again, Clara and Holt sat together on the porch, watching the sun set behind the western peaks. The wedding quilt that Clara had finished was folded over the back of the bench they'd built together, and Clara pulled it over their laps against the spring chill. "I was thinking," Holt said, his arm around her shoulders, "about building a bigger house, nothing fancy, but more room for the baby. Maybe a proper bedroom for us, a nursery, a bigger kitchen, using some of the timber from the new land," Clara asked. "If that's all right with you. It's your land, after all." "Our land," Clara corrected gently. "Everything is ours now." "That's what marriage means." Holt pressed a kiss to her temple. "Our land, then, our house, our family." Clara leaned into his warmth, feeling utterly content. Above them, the first stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. "Holt," she said softly, "do you remember what you said to me that first day, when you knelt in front of the whole town?" "I remember," Holt said. "I told you that you weren't obligated to me, that you deserved dignity and choice." "You changed my life that day," Clara said. "You gave me back something I didn't even know. I'd lost the belief that I was worth something, that I deserved respect and kindness. If you hadn't done that, I don't know if I would have had the courage to come back to you when Price showed up with that money." "You would have," Holt said with quiet certainty. "You're the bravest person I know, Clara. You crossed a continent alone. You learned a completely new way of life. You gave up a fortune because you knew what mattered. That's not something I gave you. That's something you already had inside." Clara turned to look up at him. This man who'd become her whole world. "We gave each other that courage, I think. You showed me I was worth choosing. I showed you that you were worth choosing back." Holt cupped her face in his hand, his thumb brushing away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. "Best $9 I ever spent." Clara laughed through her tears and swatted his arm gently. "That's terrible, but true," Holt said, grinning. Then his expression softened. "Though you're right, it was never about the money. It was about finding you. About finding this." He gestured to encompass the cabin, the mountain, the life they'd built together. They sat in comfortable silence as darkness fell completely and the stars came out in their thousands, bright and cold and beautiful above the mountain. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled warmly, and the home they'd made together waited for them. Above the fireplace, in a simple frame Holt had built, the 9 silver dollars gleamed in the firelight. Beneath them, Clara had painted a small inscription in careful letters. "The best investment a man can make is in kindness, and the best return is love freely given." It had become something of a legend in Briar's Crossing, the story of the mountain man who'd sent $9 for a mail-order bride and ended up with something priceless. People told it to their children, this tale of dignity and choice, of love that wasn't bought but freely chosen. But for Clara and Holt, it wasn't a legend. It was just their life, difficult sometimes, certainly, but filled with a richness that money could never measure. They'd found each other in the most unlikely way, two lonely people desperate for connection, and they'd built something lasting, something real. Something worth far more than any silver deposit or any amount of gold. As they finally went inside for the night, Holt's hand found Clara's in the darkness, their fingers interlacing with the ease of long practice. And Clara thought, not for the first time, that this was what home felt like. Not a place, but a person. Not security bought with money, but the deep certainty of being loved and valued for exactly who you were. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, a house to build, a baby to prepare for, crops to plant, a life to continue living. But tonight they had this, a warm cabin, a comfortable bed, and each other. And that, Clara thought as Holt pulled her close and she rested her head on his chest, was more than enough. It was everything.